Hello and welcome to the Kentucky Today podcast. I'm Lawrence Smith, the editor of Kentucky Today. Alongside me this week, Mark Maynard, our managing editor, and Chip Hutchison, our content editor. Not with us, Tessa Redmond, our life issues reporter. She is off for a week at camp. She's taken the youth of her church to camp this week, so she'll be back next week, assuming she's recovered from being at camp for a week with her youth. We hope it went well there. I want to start today with some news really breaking right now as we record this on a Wednesday afternoon. We've been talking about Supreme Court ruling giving Governor Andy Beshear control and authority over the State Fair Board. Well, we got word now that the state's 5 constitutional officers, the Attorney General, the Secretary of Agriculture, Commissioner of Agriculture, the Secretary of State, the Auditor, the Treasurer, all have combined to file a joint brief asking the state Supreme Court to reconsider that ruling. Not unexpected, but we didn't expect it to come from all 5 of the constitutional officers, all Republicans, asking the Supreme Court to reconsider the order giving Governor Andy Beshear, a Democrat, control over the State Fair Board and the Ethics Commission. Our first concern, primary concern, is the State Fair Board because that organization was run by a Kentucky Baptist, David Beck, whom was shockingly fired by the newly reconstituted board. Governor Andy Beshear appointed a new board, which promptly fired David Beck, which caused really outrage and concern on both sides of the aisle because he'd been doing such a good job. All that to say that the Supreme Court is going to be asked to reconsider that ruling. Guys, give me your thoughts on all that's been going on here, including an interview I did last week with David Beck, which he was very gracious and said that even before the State Fair Board acted, Governor Andy Beshear had asked him, really told him to resign from his post before that vote was even taken. So a lot of politics going on here, but Mark's first, give me your thoughts on this.
Yeah, as you said, Lawrence, it's not a surprise that this is happening. I'm not totally surprised that all the constitutional officers have kind of gotten together to do this, or not gotten together, but all agree with it. It's obviously, it's a partisan thing. It was a partisan thing when Beshear fired him as well. But, you know, you fired a man that was really doing a great job. And there was no real reason for it other than partisanship. You know, there's no grounds for that to do that. I know Governor Beshear said, you know, he wouldn't work with him or whatever, but you know, did he ever ask him to work with him really on things? I mean, everything was running so smoothly. Did he really need his input? I don't think so.
Well, that's the question I asked David Beck when I interviewed him, because as you know, Governor Beshear said he fired David Beck because Beck had indicated that he did not want to work with Governor Beshear. Well, David Beck told me that's a mischaracterization. He had reached out to Governor Beshear on several occasions, and the governor would not work with him. So, but continue. There's a dispute over exactly what's going on there.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, obviously, you know, Beshear wants somebody else in there or whatever, but this has just caused just such a big rift in the state and in state politics as well. And it wasn't necessary. It wasn't needed. And, you know, frankly, I hope the Supreme Court does at least talk it out and rehears this and, you know, hopefully come to a common sense decision that, you know, we didn't really need to do that. We'll see how they act. I mean, I don't know that they'll reverse their decision, but I'm glad what's happening is happening. It is giving them a chance to let's right this wrong.
It was a 5-4 decision, Chip, so it would take just one justice to change his or her mind on this,
Yes.
and give the authority in case of the Fair Board. The legislature had taken away from the governor and given it to the Ag Commissioner, Jonathan Schell, to appoint the majority of the Fair Board.
Yeah. Don't you find it interesting that we've had all this hubbub that could have easily been avoided? And I think it's a black mark on Governor Beshear in his time as governor. I think people are probably wondering, why are you picking this fight? There are many more important issues for you to deal with than this, than to appear so petty. And that's what it is. It appears so petty. Of course, admittedly, we're all good friends, or friends with David Beck. I've worked with him on various things before. He has taken the high road, and the governor has not. So I'm glad to see this happen. Hopefully, one of the justices will understand the public outcry and will realize, hey, we got this wrong. And I go back to what we've talked about before. Just do the right thing. And I don't think the governor has done that. And so I hope this is reversed because David Beck does not deserve the treatment from the governor that he has received.
We should make this clear. We're not making a case here that the Supreme Court should rule because David Beck is involved.
Right.
The Supreme Court should rule based on the Kentucky Constitution and Kentucky law. So they're being asked to reconsider this in light of Kentucky law and whether or not the legislature has the authority to make that move and take that power away from the governor and give it to someone else. That's the central issue here.
Yes.
All right. We'll keep a watch and see if the Supreme Court does decide to rehear this, and if so, what that schedule might be. Another big story continues to trend on our website, and that is the health of Kentucky Senior Senator Mitch McConnell. Last Sunday, Saturday afternoon, Sunday, I think it was Sunday, he finally came out with a statement, his office did, saying the reason he was hospitalized is not because of a heart attack or a stroke, but because of a fall. And he's fallen before. He had polio as a child, and as he's aged, the symptoms have arisen again and caused him to fall, and there are other symptoms as well. But Chip, you first, your thoughts on Senator McConnell finally coming out with a statement. Does this assure voters that he's okay, or does it muddy the water even more?
Well, it is extremely frustrating, I think, for those of us who have spent our lives in the news business to see all the misinformation and the jump to, I'm going to say a jump to a concussion rather than a conclusion with the way people responded, thinking, and, we all heard and saw the comments that he was brain dead. It was reported a dispatcher who was not on the scene said he had a cardiac arrest. For us, as people in the news business, it's so unnerving that people would be so quick to not believe news reports when Scott Jennings and two other very trustworthy people were quoted as saying they talked to McConnell, and people were launching conspiracy theories that was not true. Our friend, I worked with Al Cross, who's a longtime newspaper columnist here and journalist in Kentucky, and he bemoaned the fact that people were so quick to not trust reliable news media. And I think part of that is fueled by social media, where anybody can say anything, and it oftentimes grabs some traction. But I wish Senator McConnell had commented earlier. But, he's been very private about his health. And I think if we were to put ourselves in his shoes, what would we have done? I can understand him wanting to be private about it, but also understand the position he holds does demand some transparency.
I think you're absolutely right there. Mark, it's been interesting that despite the release of the statement and the accompanying photo, it has not stopped some of the conspiracy theories. There are people analyzing the photo and saying, well, this was AI, or this was doctored, or there was an old photo from years ago. All that's been debunked, but it's interesting that all this is not satisfied some people.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Chip said. You have a lot of people pretending to be news outlets or pretending to be journalists or just being themselves, because people, whatever they read on social media, they tend to believe. And especially if it's something they want to believe. They want to believe that he's I think a lot of people want to believe he's not even alive, which is terrible. But I'm just saying I think that's what a lot of people want to believe, and they're going to run with anything they can. And if you had all the Facebook sleuths looking at that picture and trying to dissect it and look at every angle of it and every part of it. I don't know. I think the media has been untrustworthy to a lot of people since really since COVID really, and has that has only picked up steam, and I think that's part of what we're getting at. I think partisanship is part of it too. There's a lot of people don't like Mitch McConnell. They don't want him in office. They wish ill will on him even, but I think he probably should have said something sooner. I understand his health's very personal, though. I understand that. But it was just getting so big and so blown up that he could have quelled it a little sooner, I think. But
I think you're right. I think some of this might have been quelled if maybe earlier on they said, well, he fell and he's recovering from a fall, without going into detail. But you're right. There's a lack of trust in institutions, including the news media, but all institutions, including the U.S. Senate and the White House and up and down the line, unfortunately. All right, let's move to something else. And it's eerie how similar this was to the Mitch McConnell story, and that is the story of the death of Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. Again, a story where emergency workers, EMS, was called to his house in D.C., but this time they found Lindsey Graham and had to break into his home, and he unfortunately had passed away. And I did not know until a couple of days later that Lindsey Graham is actually a Southern Baptist.
Yeah.
Mark, I'll start with you. Your thoughts on this story and how it's played out.
Yeah, I was stunned like everybody else when I woke up. I got up early Sunday morning and was just looking at the news and saw that. I was shocked, that happened. He hadn't been sick that we knew of or anything like that. And and again, it didn't take long for the rumors to start about what happened. How did he die? Who did this? And somebody poisoned him, and I mean just all kinds of things like that. And you really hate that, by all accounts, I tell you what, he was a great politician, did a tremendous job of being a bridge, I think, between Republicans and Democrats, really. And, he was certainly, he loved Israel and tried to help them. He did a lot of great things. I think he's going to be sorely missed in that Senate, because I think he was one that that brought people together more, and we need a whole lot more of that than we need the opposite. So I hated to see him. Die, and I didn't know he's Southern Baptist either till yesterday, actually. So that's good too, I guess. But anyway, by all accounts he's a believer, and that's the best thing about it, I guess.
And Chip, it is interesting that Graham ran against Trump in 2016.
Yeah.
Lost, of course. And he had a choice. He could be a never Trumper, an anti-Trumper, similar to Liz Cheney, or he could decide, I'm going to work with this guy. And he chose to work with Trump and became one of his closest advisors. And as Mark said, kind of a bridge between kind of the old Republican Party and the new.
Yes, you're exactly right. He was so well respected on both sides of the aisle. He made some pretty strong statements questioning Trump's ability to be the president, to be the commander in chief. And yet when that was over, he reconciled with Trump. And I say he did in the biblical way. Romans 12:18, if it be possible, as much as depends on you, live at peace with all men. I think that was Lindsey Graham's motto for life. He stood up for what he thought was right, but he was also a peacemaker. And he will be sorely missed because so many people let their egos get in ahead of everything they do. I sense that Lindsey Graham did not do that. So we need more statesmen like him. And he will be missed.
And his sister, whom he raised from the time she was 13 years old after the death of their parents, is now sitting in that seat, sworn in today or yesterday
Yes,
in that
yesterday, yeah.
seat. And we'll see whether she decides she wants to run or someone else will run and take over that seat. There has to be a special election in South Carolina. Another, this time an opinion piece that really took off this week in Kentucky Today was one written by Jacob Ogan. He's with the Commonwealth Policy Center here in Kentucky. And it was a column entitled, "Socialism Comes for Kentucky," a very provocative title. And I talked to him and asked him to back that up. Why is he saying socialism is coming to Kentucky? Here's what he said.
I'll just begin by, I think it's a good place to begin by quoting Ronald Reagan. And he said that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. And he, of course, said that within the context of the rise of collectivism and the Cold War. And really, I think that statement rings very true today. As we look across the United States, we see the rise of a different form of collectivism taking place all across the United States. And I think that's perhaps most notable in the election of Zoran Mamdani, a Democratic Socialist there, to the New York City mayoralty. But we see also in New York City the nomination of 3 Democratic Socialist candidates in the Democratic primary for the United States House of Representatives. Now, that's gained a lot of attention across the media, and I think a lot of your listeners have probably heard a lot about that election. But the fact is that this rise is not limited, this rise of socialism is not limited to New York City. It's taking place all across the United States. It's taking place also in places like Washington, D.C., in places like Seattle, Washington, but it's also seen within the confines of the Commonwealth of Kentucky as well. In Louisville, Kentucky, we actually have a sitting Louisville Metro Council member who identifies openly and proudly as a Democratic Socialist. He has it there in his official government biography. Mr. J.P. Leninger is his name, and he ran on radical leftist policies, things like government-owned, municipally owned grocery stores for citizens of his municipality there. That's a radical socialist position, and yet he holds elected office within the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And really within that same section of Louisville, they also nominated in their Democratic primary an openly Democratic Socialist candidate for the Kentucky House of Representatives in the 43rd District. And given the Democratic makeup of that district, it is almost guaranteed that we are going to have a Democratic Socialist serving in the Kentucky House of Representatives. And I think that's a very alarming thing to a lot of Kentuckians, but also something that's really kind of flown under the radar of a lot of Kentuckians as well.
The 2 examples you gave in Kentucky, here in Kentucky, are both from, as you mentioned, Louisville's urban area. And of course, we're seeing that in urban areas across the country as well. Washington, D.C., New York, you mentioned, somewhat in Michigan. Why do you think the socialist message has particular resonance in areas like that?
Yeah. Well, if you look across the United States political history, you will see that generally, as you get closer to a coast, or if you get closer to an urban area, you're going to find a greater concentration of liberal policies and liberal ideologies. Urban centers, and especially coastal urban centers, have a tendency to attract very leftward thinking. And that's something that's been true really since the founding of the United States, and it's something that's very true today. Now, Louisville's not on a coast, unless you count the Ohio River as a coast. I don't think many people do. But Louisville is a metro area. It is very much an urban area, the largest city in Kentucky. And you find within an urban area, as it's often seen as sort of an intellectual hub. You know, we have the University of Louisville in the city of Louisville. We have several other universities as well. And a lot of times you see in these sort of intellectual hubs within states or within nations, you see more liberal policies. And I think there's a number of reasons for that, but maybe one of which is simply the fact that these places are often divorced from the everyday reality that a lot of Americans experience. The employment types within the city are simply different. The way communities are built are simply different. But the fact is that frankly, those cities don't necessarily represent reality for a lot of Kentuckians and for a lot of Americans as well. The work just simply isn't as grounded there. You find within those contexts, again, a concentration of university faculty hires and a lot of students, things like that. that really give rise to a lot of these more liberal policies. And so I think that's why, in particular, a lot of these socialist candidates are coming from places like Louisville. But that certainly doesn't necessarily preclude the rise of socialist candidates in other parts of the state either.
Talk about that, because when you think of these urban areas, you often have areas of broken families, violence often accompanying that, poverty in many cases, a reliance on government assistance, generally, not exclusively, but generally there. Do you see those factors coming to play elsewhere? And is that your concern for the spread of this message across other parts of the state?
I certainly think that's very concerning as well. And of course, as you look at more rural areas of the state, you do see a greater reliance on things like government assistance. And really, a lot of that does have sort of roots in more collectivist thinking. I'm not saying all government assistance is wrong, certainly, but that sort of thinking is a danger, I think, to a lot of rural areas as well. I think another danger is a lot of rural Kentuckians will send their children to be educated at places like the University of Louisville, where they'll find a lot of very leftward thinking professors and faculty, things that they're not really teaching what has historically held the nation together. They're not historically teaching important things like civics or economic history, world history, recognizing that socialism has actually failed really everywhere that it has been tried in its purest form. And of course, most notably, the fall of the Soviet Union and the great bloodbath of so much of what happened there within the Soviet Union is absolutely terrifying to learn about and to read about. But a lot of that history is frankly ignored in places like the University of Louisville, University of Kentucky, some of these more liberal-leaning universities. But rural Kentuckians continue to send their children there, maybe not to study economics, maybe not to study history, maybe just simply study medicine or law or political science. But they're going to find a lot of those things simply glossed over in the history books. But the fact is, those things are very important for a national memory to develop around the horrors of collectivism.
Can this be traced further back even to a lack of civics and economic education in K through 12 public schools?
I think so as well, absolutely. So much of, again, that very important economic history, political history of the Soviet Union and of the failure of collectivism, socialism, and communism is simply glossed over in so many of our public schools. That's a very important struggle of the 20th century, perhaps the most important struggle of the 20th century, and something that Americans really in the 1980s emerged from victory, emerged in victory out of the Cold War and had so much of a national spirit cultivated and national pride, but so much of that has been lost, I think, in the public school system in Kentucky.
It's a good point. The distance from the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, is also a contributing factor. From a Christian perspective, then, what's the argument against socialism? If the Kentucky Baptist encounters those kinds of arguments, what's the counter?
Yeah, absolutely. I think even going back to the Cold War, yet again, we find the answer to collectivism. If you walk into the House Gallery, the United States House of Representatives, you will find above the Speaker's desk the motto of the United States House of Representatives. And that was put there in the 1960s during the Cold War. And it says, "In God we trust." And that was placed there in defiance of the godless regime of the Soviet Union. And so frankly, the answer to collectivism and to the dangers of collectivism is Christianity itself. And that was something that was recognized at the highest level of government during the Cold War era, but something that has been almost entirely abandoned today. But it still rings very true. I think also for Christians thinking about the rise of socialism, we have to also recognize that socialism does seek to answer real issues in the world. There are real issues that it seeks to answer, things like affordability, things like homelessness, lack of healthcare, things of that nature. The question for Christians is that the role of government? Is it good? Is it safe to concentrate power in government to answer some of these issues? Or are these things better dealt with on the local level with things like nonprofits, things like even churches reaching in and meeting those community needs? I think in Louisville, where I live, there are a number of ministries that seek to answer questions of homelessness and addiction and joblessness. I think those ministries are dealing with those things oftentimes much better than any sort of government program can. And I think if you look at how the government stewards its public resources, even something as simple and as part of our everyday life as the United States Postal Service, you see an organization, an institution that is facing constant mismanagement of funds, constantly coming up short in its ability to perform tasks that other private corporations are doing much better. I think even as you look across other facets of American life, you see the failure of government to supply some of those more efficient operations. You go to the DMV, you're waiting forever in line. That's something that's dominated the headlines over the last year or so in Kentucky, is the inefficiency of the DMV. Do we really want those people running our grocery stores? Do we really want that sort of bureaucracy running every part of our lives? You know, I don't want to wake up every day and have to ask the government to provide for my most basic needs. And as a Christian, I recognize ultimately that I am responsible, yes, for so much of providing for myself and for our families as well. But also, the government is not responsible ultimately for that. We are not responsible ultimately for our every need. Ultimately, the Lord himself is. We don't wake up every day and pray that the federal government would give us our daily bread. We pray for the Lord to provide our daily bread. We recognize ultimately as Christians, the answer is not to look to government to provide for those most basic needs, but ultimately to look to ourselves and ultimately to God himself to provide for our needs.
That's Jacob Ogan of the Commonwealth Policy Center. We are fast running out of time, but Chip, I want to get quickly your take on Jacob saying that essentially the answer to the lure of socialism is the gospel. Churches need to be about loving God and loving neighbor.
That's exactly right, Lawrence, and I certainly appreciate Jacob authoring that piece for us. You know, you look back in our history, and socialism has proven not to be good for society. It was that way in the first century. The book of Acts chronicles that, which got to the point where if a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. And then when the colonists, early history of the colonists was they found that having everything in common was not going to be substantial for the society. And so I do appreciate his comments, his remarks that the gospel is what changes things, and that we need to have the gospel at the core of our lives and of how we live our lives.
Mark, you wrote a great story, transitioning to something else now, about a demonstration of love of neighbor, and it involves, again, Kentucky Disaster Relief, helping a family that was badly in need.
Yeah, you know, our Kentucky Baptist Relief volunteers, they shine like silver foil reflecting the sun. I mean, they are just the brightest, best people in the world, and how they treat people and how they respond to these disasters. And, you know, they don't just go in there and work. They care for these people. And it was in Brandenburg, of course, from the June 27th storm that really caused a lot of havoc, and it did there. It flooded this house of this family. You know, it started off in their yard, and it got real deep, and then it got into the house. And this family had a disabled boy who's 12 years old, who at 6 years old had gotten into a pond, went underneath the water, was underneath the water for 14 minutes. And a police officer was able to get him out, and they resuscitated him. And he's living with the help of a ventilator right now, but he's bedfast, and they're caring for him. And it's the Lopez family. The mother's name was Megan Lopez, and she had the most positive outlook I've ever heard of anybody, and that just goes to show you, what God can do in almost any situation, But she was, she was a church member. She worked the Bible school. She tried to make his life as normal as possible too. And she and her husband. And I know they were so thankful for the help that Kentucky Disaster Relief brought. And they were helpful for as much as the physical help, they were the spiritual help that they brought with them as well. And I think that's what, separates them from a lot of other just emergency helpers. Not that emergency helpers are bad, they're all good, but they bring a little more to the game, our disaster relief people. And I'm thankful for them and for Ron Crow and how he leads that group.
Yes, indeed. I want to skip to a sports story now. And Chip, I'm going to toss this to you as the UK grad and ardent University of Kentucky fan and follower of the Kentucky Wildcats, as well as you, Mark. But Tubby Smith going to be inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame. Does he deserve that?
I think he does. He did an admirable job, although there were some years that I decided I wasn't going to drive from Princeton to Lexington to watch one of his teams play. But yet overall, he had a great run at UK. He was a man of integrity, of character. He's got a great long record over the long haul. And I'm glad to see him as something that we UK fans can celebrate.
Won a national championship his first year.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. And with something fun. Ale 81 celebrating its 100th anniversary later this summer with a big party. Ale 81, of course, a Kentucky product, a century old. Do we care or don't care, Mark?
Well, personally, I guess I don't care that much, but I understand the logic behind it, especially if you're from Winchester. It's a big deal. If you're from Central Kentucky, it's a big deal. I can't remember drinking too many L8s. They didn't make it to Ashland necessarily. I mean, you could get it there, but at the grocery store and things. But I don't think it was a hot seller there necessarily. But I wouldn't want to go on record as saying I'm against L8. That's for sure, because I know a lot of people swear by it.
Chip, care or don't care about Ale 81 being 100 years old?
Personally, Lawrence, I don't care. If you're an L81 fan, please don't be insulted. I don't know if I should admit this. I've never drank an L81. So that tells you I've either been sheltered or ignorant. I'm not sure which. But it doesn't mean much to me. But as Mark said, it does to a lot of people, and certainly I respect them for that.
Yeah, I'm with you. I don't think don't remember having an Ale81. I may have, I just don't recall. But I care in the fact that it is a Kentucky product that's 100 years old, employing people in the bluegrass and known really in many parts of probably the world. So we care about that. I'm not sure I care that much about the drink itself, but care about the image it projects and the success it's had. Well, that's it for Kentucky Today. Thanks for joining us once again. For more information on what's going on among Baptist life in Kentucky and general news as well, go to KentuckyToday.com. And also check us out on our new YouTube channel and give us a good review there, as well as on your favorite podcast platform. And for more on the cooperative program and all that makes what the cooperative program does possible, go to kybaptist.org. Until next time, we'll see you on the Kentucky Today, Lord willing.